faces. We all know the verse. It's good. This is a second introduction, so it's good that recording just started now. We all know the verse that says that there's shivim panim to the Torah, that there are 70 faces to the Torah. But actually, when we look at this parsha and the peripheral parashot around it, what we're reading in these weeks is that there are also 70 faces to the Mishkan. And I don't mean this metaphorically. I mean this literally. Because when you look at the description of the Mishkan, one of the most recurring terms in the Mishkan is the word panim, face. It appears 76 times in the description of the Mishkan, and it kind of hints that this is a very central theme. In fact, some of the places where the word panim, face, appears for a native Hebrew speaker are very unnatural. For example, it says that the candles of the menorah, they lit themselves in the face of the menorah. What does that even mean? The Chazal explained that they were all facing the center, but that is already an explanation, but the word is there, the face of the menorah. And then we have the cherubim on top of the ark that were facing each other, pnehem ish el achiv. And of course, the bread. Out of all things, it is lechem apanim, it's the bread of the face. Those are very strange descriptions, but they just come as to show how the Torah goes out of its way to include the word face in almost every detail of the Mishkan, 76 times. And this is in direct dialogue with a negotiation that occurs in the middle of the parashiyot of the Mishkan. It's going to occur next week, between Moshe and God. After
this, blueprint for how to conduct your.
After the sin of the golden calf, the Kadosh Baruch Hu actually informs Moshe that he's punishing Israel and he's not going to be escorting them into the promised land. And Moshe is having nothing of it. He says, no. You're not sending an angel instead of you. You are coming with us. We need you to escort us to Israel. But he uses an interesting term. In this discussion, it's all about whether God will send an angel to deliver Israel or whether the face of God will go with them. So in that sense, the argument is about the face of God. Moshe tells God, if your face is not coming with us, do not deliver us to the promised land. And interestingly, the action point right after this discussion is that when Bnei Israel are subject to this punishment, the Mishkan is placed outside of the camp. It's placed at the periphery of the camp. But eventually, when God forgives Bnei Israel for the sin of the golden calf, the Mishkan is resituated at the core, at the center of the Machaneh, at the center of the camp. So this discussion, whether God's face will be going with Israel, or whether it'll just be an angel, some messenger, but God's face itself will not be escorting Israel, whatever that even means, the action point that comes from that is that the Mishkan is either outside of the camp or inside of the camp. Together with the fact that the word face is the recurring theme of the Mishkan, I would like to suggest that the question if the face of God will go with Israel or not is symbolized by the Mishkan. The Mishkan is, in a sense, the face of God. And the end of the story, where the Mishkan is situated at the center of the camp, going together with Israel to the promised land, is actually God's statement, yes, my face will go with you. Now, if the Mishkan is the face of God, and if the Torah gives us such an elaborate description of every detail of what the Mishkan looked like, it's very tempting to ask, okay, so what does God look like? What does the face of God look like? Now, this is a very strange question. In fact, it's borderline heretic question. But I would like to suggest that this is a legitimate question because I've been speaking about theology and I know nothing about theology. But the truth is, the question, what is the face of God or what is the image of God, is not a theological question. It's a question that seeks guidance for man, seeks guidance for the behavior of people. For example, Chachamim in the Mishnah, in the Pirkei Avot, they say, you need to mimic the behavior of God. Mahu rachum v'chanun, God is merciful. Afatati rachum v'chanun, you should also be merciful. Mahu erech hapayim, God is tolerant. You should also be tolerant. So asking what is the image of God is really asking what is virtuous, what is good, what is the moral guidance for man. And therefore, I think it's fair to ask, how does the Torah, through the symbols of the Mishkan, portray the image of God for us as men, as people here down on earth, to get moral guidance from the symbolism of the Mishkan? And I'm going to do that in 2 minutes. But before that, I want to take a step back, because I think many of you will relate to what I'm saying. Definitely, I feel that. We sometimes feel a little bit uncomfortable when we read the parshiot, the portions of the Torah that speak about the Mishkan, that speak about the Kohanim rituals, that speak about the sacrifices. These things, they seem a bit anachronistic, irrelevant in our modern world, sometimes even morally questionable, according to our modern values. And I want to suggest a framework of how to treat these portions of the Torah. And the first thing about this framework is not to be apologetic. We like to say, okay, this is a thing of the past. We like to also quote the prophets who were outspoken in some verses against those sacrificial rituals. But I think this would not be completely true to the case, because something like 30 to 40% of the Torah is invested in those topics, in this context. So we cannot just dismiss it as marginal. What I would like to suggest is the following framework on how to relate to everything Mishkan, everything related to sacrifices or to the Kohanic priestly rituals. And it comes from the acknowledgement that every culture, every society has its own set of symbols, ceremonies, and rituals. And in a sense, these symbols and rituals, they are metaphors, they are a language. And once you tap into this language, you open a window into the set of values and educational ideas that this culture or society wishes to bestow on each one of its constituents. So what happens when we encounter the rituals and the metaphors and the symbols of a foreign society? It's just like encountering a foreign language. And when you encounter a foreign language, you don't need to argue with it or be judgmental. You need to bring an interpretation. You want to understand not what the language is, but what the contents that lies behind the words. So the language might be 3,000 years old, but the contents might be equally relevant today. So I would like to suggest that Am Yisrael in biblical times, the 3,000 years ago, Bnei Israel, the biblical us, in many senses, they're a foreign society. They're very different from us. They speak a different language. They have a different set of symbols and a different set of associations. And therefore, when we encounter the symbols, metaphors, and rituals of the Torah, what we need to bring is exactly what we bring for a foreign language. And that is try to translate what they mean into our language. And with this in mind, let's try to understand what is the symbolism behind the Mishkan. And the first thing that might strike us when we look at the design of the Mishkan is that it is very similar to the design of a human dwelling. In fact, right away, even before we enter the Mishkan, we right away see that the Mishkan is a tent. It has wooden beams. On top of that, it has fabrics, and you can dismantle it, disassemble it, and it's mobile. So the Israel are vagabonds in the Midbar. They are wanderers. They live in tents. And so the dwelling that they create for Hashem is also in a tent. So the Mishkan mimics a human dwelling, but that's not just at the macro level, not just from the outside. Also, when we go inside, we can look for in the Torah what symbolizes a classic human apartment. What did an apartment look like in biblical times? Well, in the story of Elisha, we actually have a list of the interior design. And it turns out that an apartment has a mitah, shulchan, kiseh, umenorah. It has a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp. That's the classic structure of a human dwelling. It was true 3,000 years ago. We're a bit richer today, but it's pretty much true also for our modern houses. When you enter the Mishkan, you see exactly that. Well, you see a menorah, the lamp to your left, and you see a shulchan with bread on it to your right. What about the chair? Well, I would like to, again, tap into the world of symbols and metaphors in biblical times. Many times the Bible relates to Hashem, to Kadosh Baruch Hu, as Yoshev HaKeruvim, the one who sits on top of the Keruvim. So very naturally, it's in the sanctuary, in the Holy of Holies. That's where the Keruvim are, and they are the throne. They are like the chair, or symbolically, they're like the chair on which God sits. In fact, very often when God speaks to Moshe, it says that he spoke to him from Miben HaKeruvim, from between the Keruvim. So very naturally to think about it is like God's inner office, and that is his throne. That is where he sits and communicates with Moshe. You might ask, what about the bed? Well, God never sleeps, so it's not completely perfect. But the first impression that we get, and I know this is still kind of vague, but the first impression that we get is that the Mishkan is designed after human dwellings. It is designed after a human home, and it's designed to mimic the way people actually live. But this mimicry of the human world doesn't end there, because when you enter the Mishkan, to your left, you see the menorah. And the menorah, the light, also in the Gemara, it symbolizes the wisdom. It symbolizes the Torah. So it symbolizes everything that is spiritual about man. And that makes sense, right? Because this is a holy place. This is the sanctuary. And this is exactly where we want to celebrate the elevated side of man, the spirituality, the ability of man to touch something which is divine, the wisdom, the Torah. That is what is symbolized by the light of the menorah. But when we face our head to the other side, we right there see the table, and on top of the table are situated loaves of bread. This represents something which is very, very human. On the one hand, we have the ability to elevate ourselves to the spiritual, but man also has earthly needs, and man has material needs. And we like to say sometimes that if there's no flour, there's no Torah. But that has a hierarchy, right? You need the flour, you need the food, so you have the power to learn Torah. In the Mishkan, there is no hierarchy. They're right against each other. The spiritual and the material are equally relevant. So that's a depiction of the human dwelling. I mean, God doesn't eat bread, of course, but it is a depiction of God's home, of God's face, in the face of the duality of the human existence, which is both spiritual and material at the same time. But of course, we can understand this is like the prelude, right? This is the foyer of the Mishkan. What happens when you go to the inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh Kodashim? There, of course, we will only have a representation of the spiritual, of the elevated, of the divine. And it's true, because there at the Holy of Holies, what we have is the Ark. And on top of the Ark, it's decorated by the two Keruvim. We'll talk about them in a moment. But when you open the Ark, it is not empty. Inside the Ark, we see the broken covenants, the Luchot HaBrit, the Shivrei Luchot, the broken covenants with the 10 commandments on them. So clearly, that represents the wisdom, the Torah, the tradition, the values. That represents the elevated and the divine. And if that was the only thing in the Ark, we would have said, okay, right. So in the Holy of Holies, you only put what is sacred. You only put what is sanctified. But that's not completely true, because there's another item inside the Ark. Inside the Ark, right next to the broken covenants, there is a jar. And in that jar is a sample of the man, the bread that Bnei Israel ate in the Midbar. In their wandering in the Midbar, it is always centered around two things, around the Torah, Matan Torah, the teachings of the Torah, the laws of Moshe, but also very much around the material needs. Bnei Israel need to drink, Bnei Israel need to eat. And those are both celebrated. Again, no hierarchy. They're both equally sanctified in the Holy of Holies. So what I would like to suggest is that if we look at the symbols of the Mishkan, if we look at the ideas behind the Mishkan, if we look at what is virtuous and moral, the Torah puts the human image. It portrays God in a human image, in a sense, and it puts the human image with all its duality, with all its partiality, with all its earthly and material needs, as what is in the values of the Torah, the core values, what is to be sanctified, what is sacred. The Torah celebrates humanness. But it doesn't end there, because we didn't talk about the Keruvim yet. So what are the Keruvim? We typically have in mind two angelic figures with wings that are facing each other. And that definitely seems like something which is superhuman, something which is, part of the divine, part of the sky, part of the heavens. But when we look at the other interpretations, Chachamim in Masechet Yoma have a completely different interpretation of what the Keruvim were. It's pretty known in the Midrash in Masechet Yoma, they said that the Keruvim were a man and a woman embracing each other. That is the imagery. the imagery of what's more human than thinking about the Holy of Holies as the room, as the dwelling of God. And in there, we put a picture of human intimacy, of the fact that we need love and we need affection. And this bind between a man and a woman, it's a symbol of everything human, and it's sanctified in the Holy of Holies. And up to here, I was only focusing on the words of the Torah and on the Midrashim of Chachamim in the Gemara or in the Mishnah. But to get a real sense of what the Keruvim are, historically speaking, I'd like to wear my other hat as a scientist. So that's not the kind of research I do, but I am exposed to research done in other areas. And modern archaeology can actually explain to us better what Keruvim really are. And I want you to listen well, because this, I think, to some people may be very, very surprising. The word Keruvim, it's a singular word in the Bible. It doesn't appear very often, but it does appear as a recurring theme in the Mishkan. It was not only on the top of the ark, that's the most well-known depiction, but it was also part of the embroidery of the fabrics decorating the Mishkan. And it's a singular word, but modern archaeology was able to decipher what it means. Now, I cannot dig artifacts out of the ground here through Zoom. So instead of going to archaeology, I will go again to the verbal context and try to convince you that the Keruvim are nothing like what you pictured them until now. And I want to jump with you, so bear with me for a second. If you lost me somewhere on the details here, this is a great point to kind of join the train again, because we're opening something, a new front now. I want to jump to the book of Ezekiel. And let me say something here before we jump to the book of Ezekiel. As a native Hebrew speaker, it's fine. I can say sanctuary and I can say humanness, but when I have to say things like Keruvim or Ezekiel, that's a real tongue breaker for me. But okay, here, I managed to do it. So in the book of Ezekiel, the first chapter opens with one of the most pictorial prophecies of the Bible. It's called Maaseh Merkavah. It's the revelation of God as Ezekiel experienced it. And it's really fantastic in the sense that it has really, it comes out of a fantasy movie. And one of the things that Ezekiel describes is images that have 4 faces. And here I'm going to use the Bibi Netanyahu way of counting with my fingers. So the first face is a face of a man. And the second face is the face of an eagle. And the third face is the face of a lion. And the fourth face is the face of an ox. So remember this, we have man, eagle, lion, and remember the fourth one, that's important, ox. But then the nice thing that Ezekiel does for us is that he repeats the same prophecy again in chapter 10. And I won't say it's exactly verbatim, but it is really consistent. It's just one-to-one. He really repeats everything from chapter 1 again in chapter 10. Once again, he relates to these 4-faced images. And he once again repeats exactly what they look like. They have a face of a man, a face of an eagle, a face of a lion. You can unmute now. What is the 4th face? I emphasize that pretty much. The 4th face, he says, is the face of a kruv. But wait a second. In chapter 1, it was the face of an ox. And now in chapter 10, everything is exactly the same, except that it's the face of a kruv. Well, it turns out that in ancient biblical Hebrew, kruv is a synonym of an ox. Some of you might have encountered that when they learned Gemara. The word karav means to plow, what you do with an ox in the ancient agricultural days. So what are the keruvim? They're made of gold. The Torah is very explicit on that. And they are in the shape of winged oxen. Archaeologists have found plenty of those artifacts all over the ancient state of Israel. So I would like to change your mind about what the interior design of the Holy of Holies is. According to the Pshat, not the Midrash, not the Masoret, the Pshat, the archaeological Pshat, what appeared in the Holy of Holies is an ark. And on that ark were 2 images of golden oxen. So what does the Torah put right at the center of the Holy of Holies? This is the symbol of the sin. It is the golden calf. It's the symbol of humanness, because humans, they need earthly needs. They need bread. Humans, they need intimacy. But mostly, what is most human, what is most non-angelic, what is most part of our down-to-earth existence is our ability to fail. It's our ability to sin. And the Torah is not shy out of that. That's exactly what it puts in the Holy of Holies, the symbol of everything that is human. So what the Mishkan actually portrays is that the core values, remember, the symbols are a language, but that language behind it, once we tap into these symbols, represents what we educate for. It represents what we believe, what is virtuous and moral. And the Torah portrays the Mishkan in the face of a human. So the Torah puts at its core values, human values. It puts humans at the center. In fact, this is perhaps the most important theme of the Torah. From the Sefer Bereshit, from the creation of the world, which puts human at the center of creation, all the way down to the creation of the Mishkan by people, it just puts human values at its core. Now, we think about liberal humanism, which did exactly that. It said mankind is at the center of all values. We tend to think of that as a rebellion against religion, something that went against the tradition because it marginalized the role of the divine. It basically took God out of the equation and put humans at the center of our value system. But the truth is that liberal humanism is not at all rebellion. It is rooted in the mere values of the Torah. The Torah uses a theological language. It uses theological symbols to promote human values. And at the center of liberal humanism are the values of freedom, equality, and dignity for every man. This is precisely the message of the Torah. It starts with Yetziat Mitzrayim, which precisely brought these values to light, freedom, equality, and dignity. But then the other virtue of humanism is the human creativity, the right, or I would even say the obligation of mankind to create something in the world, to do something, to act. And that is exactly in the Mishkan, because our narrative, our national story begins with Yetziat Mitzrayim. It begins with the ideas of equality and freedom, but it ends with the national project to build the Mishkan, where everyone participated. The Torah emphasizes the broad participation in the construction of the Mishkan, even, parts of society that, in ancient times were kind of marginalized, were at the outskirts of society, like women, for example. They were very active participants in the construction of the Mishkan. The Torah repeats that 3 or 4 times, that the women also contributed to the construction of the Mishkan, because this a project which celebrates human creativity, which celebrates the ability of mankind to act in the world. This project is something that has to have everyone part of it. Everyone has to experience creativity, freedom, dignity, and equality. Now, it is interesting in that sense to see how the Mishkan is a closure for the story that begins in Sefer Bereshit. Because in Sefer Bereshit, God creates the world. It creates a dwelling for man and puts man at the center of that world. And now in the Mishkan, in an amazing parallel, man creates a dwelling for God. And if God created the man, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of the divine, man recreates a dwelling for God and portrays him, designs him, with the imagery in the image of a man. And in that sense, we can see all the parallels, because we know that God rested on the 7th day from his melacha. We rest on the 7th day from our melacha. And what is the melachot that we rest from? It's the melachot of the Mishkan. So the creation represents the melacha of God into the world. The Mishkan represents the melacha, the work, the creation of man in this world. It creates a parallel between the divine and human, and uses the theological language to express liberal humanistic values. Now, I'm saying all this because, we are all reading the news from Israel. We're all tracking also the polarization and social divide in many other countries, Israel just being one of it. And I think part of it is because of the decline of what was once a consensus around liberal humanist values. And the notion that these values are not just a novelty, but they are actually embedded deeply in our tradition, should be able to soothe out a lot of the internal discussion in modern Israel. In some sense, the demonstrations now and the social polarization is portrayed as a fight between Yehudit and Democratic, Jewish or democratic. But the truth is that these are by no means contradicting virtues. It should be Yehudit and therefore democratic, because the liberal values of democracy are actually deeply embedded, deeply rooted in our tradition, in its symbols, in its rituals. Now, with this, I want to go back to the ideas of Purim, because there's another thing, and I think this is the real thing about liberal humanism that is considered a rebellion against religion. And it has to do with the sources of authority. Humanism puts man in charge. It says man can act in the world. Man can have, with his own wisdom, decipher and decode the way this world behaves. This is how modern science was born. This is what I make my living out of. I think that these ideas are not at all foreign also to the Jewish way of thought, but you will not find them in the Torah. We find them actually in Chachamim, in Chazal, in the Gemara. Because the one thing that Chazal do is that they replaced everything that has to do with Beit HaMikdash and centered the world around Beit HaMidrash. You might think of it as this sort of necessity. Beit HaMikdash was no longer existent, and so they needed to find a replacement, but it's more than just a technical replacement. It's an idea. Because in Beit HaMidrash, the actors are really human. And in Beit HaMidrash, when you need to decipher the truth, when you need to reach the truth, what you do is argue about it and vote, and you make them, and you rule by the majority. So what Chazal actually are saying, these are means of making decisions that are only centered around human wisdom. And this is the new variable that Chazal introduced into the equation. It has to do with the sources of religious authority. Traditionally, in biblical times, the source of religious authority was the revelation. It was the prophecy. The prophet gave the voice of God. And where did he get it from? Because God revealed himself to the prophet. This is also the way our original Matan Torah took place. It was a revelation. It was thunders, lightning, 10 plagues, ripping of the sea. All of that were revelations that you cannot argue with. So it never says that God actually held the mountain on top of Israel and forced them, coerced them to say yes. But of course he did, because what could they do? How could you say no to the thunders, to the lightning, to the miracles? You cannot say no. It's you are forced to say yes. But then Purim is a completely different holiday. Purim was a contentious holiday. So when Esther writes down to the authorities, the rabbis in Israel, and say, okay, we had a miracle, let's make a holiday about it, it wasn't a consensus. They weren't convinced. Why? Because there is no miracle. Because you can argue about the events. There is no 10 plagues. God did not split the sea. There were no thunders and lightning. In fact, if there is a miracle or no miracle in Purim, that's a matter of human interpretation. You need to look at the events and decide, are they meaningful or not? In fact, there is a miracle in Purim. But who is the center of that miracle? It's not about divine intervention. It's about human heroism, specifically women's heroism that brought the miracle with their bare hands. So in that sense, if you accept Purim, you are accepting the fact that human wisdom, human authority is what rules down here on earth. This is the novelty of Chachamim. When they talk about Beit HaMidrash, when they talk about Torah, when they say that arguments and disputes are within Beit HaMidrash, and if the divine intervention will say that halacha is like this guy and not that guy, we will not necessarily listen, because we make decisions here on earth based on human wisdom, based on human judgment. That is tremendous novelty. And that novelty, the litmus paper, I know you accepted that novelty if you accept the miracle of Purim. So Purim is the second Matan Torah. It's the Matan of Torah Shebe'al Peh. It's the Matan of the second Torah, the Torah that completes this strategy of putting human at the center, at the core values. And with this comes responsibility, because when you put humans at the center, and when you look at the virtue of human wisdom and human judgment and human's ability to make decisions and understand the world, you're also calling for people to act. You're also calling for people to say, it's within your reach. You can affect the world. You can do something in the world. You can build a Mishkan for the divine. I want to end this in 5 more minutes by just looking at one other set of symbols that complements the picture. Because part of what we're experiencing, at least now in Israel, is not just social polarization. It's not just this argument about humanist liberal values and their rebellion, or maybe deep roots in tradition. It is also about leadership and about the crisis of leadership. And I think the Mishkan has something to say about that too, specifically in the Parsha of Tetzaveh. Because the Parsha of Tetzaveh describes the inauguration of the priests and the high priest specifically. And when we look at the symbols that are associated with that, we can kind of understand what is the educational norm that the Torah is pushing to when it comes to leadership. We'll start with the small priests, the regular priests. They have 4 garments of clothing. That is how they are inaugurated, by dressing up according to their uniform. And their uniform includes just a robe, a belt, a hat, and boxer shorts. Yes, boxer shorts. I'm not wrong about that. It actually says that. So those are working clothes. These are civil servants. They're there to work. They're not there to wear anything which is extravagant or symbolic. The symbolism or the uniform set, you are civil servants. Those are your garments to work. By the way, they're not yours. You cannot wear them outside. They're only there for work. That's the meaning of them being sanctified. They are holy, they're sanctified, they are dedicated for your civil service, not for your own use. But then we look at the high priest, and the high priest has several additional garments. First of all, he wears a me'il, a coat, which is like a big talis, made of tchelet, made of wool. And we know that this coat was a symbol of leadership. For example, when David fights over leadership with Shaul, it always has to do with him ripping the coat, taking the coat, wearing the coat, and so on. But then what kind of leadership does he have? Well, he has 2 other accessories. First of all, he has the choshen, which is 12 stones, 12 gems on the name of all the 12 tribes. And then he has the ephod, which is same thing, 6 gems on each of his shoulders, on which we inscribe the name of the tribes. Well, you know, the Kohen Gadol, he enters the Kodesh Kodashim, he enters the Mishkan, and you know, how much ego is there? I mean, you can really feel that he achieved something in life. But he comes there dressed in what he really is. And he's not representing, not other priests, not his family, not his friends, not his constituents. He is representing the nation, all the 12 tribes. That's what he wears on him when he enters the Mishkan. But perhaps the most important thing, and this is something I would take as is for modern inauguration ceremonies of leaders, is that the Kohen Gadol offers 3 sacrifices on the day of his coronation. The first sacrifice is a shlamim. The second sacrifice is orlah. And the third sacrifice is chatat. Now, once again, when we read these verses in the Torah, and I'm to blame just as well for that, I'm guilty of that, we tend to not listen, because they speak in a language which is very, very foreign to our modern world. Even our modern religious world has nothing of those symbols inside it. But remember, we're looking at those symbols, we're looking at those rituals, and we are trying to translate what they mean. For a person living 3,000 years ago, the symbolism of these 3 sacrifices was clear, because they knew that that was the language they spoke. Just like when you look at the stars and stripes, or when in Israel we stand when the siren sounds, it might sound strange for someone 400 years from now looking back, but for us, the meaning, the emotions that these ceremonies are meant to evoke is clear. What are the emotions that the different sacrifices are meant to evoke? Well, the first one is the shlamim. And a korban shlamim, a peace offering, is an offering that you bring when you have a big simcha, when something really festive happened. When would a person typically bring this kind of offering? Well, if they have a wedding in their family, if they overcame a big disease, or if they won the lottery. The way you celebrate this offering is that you have to eat most of it, and you have to eat most of it at the same day. So that means you have to invite all your friends, and you have to eat it with lots of bread. And so it's just a celebration. And the way you celebrate is with yourself, with your community, and with God. You bring your friends, you go up to the Mishkan, and you bring your offering. And that's very natural, because if I were today selected to be the Kohen Gadol, the leader, imagine that I wanted that position. That's definitely a reason for gratitude. That's definitely a reason for happiness. This is a big achievement. This is a big day. You have been coronated. We have bestowed our trust in you. So it's natural for the Kohen Gadol to feel happiness and gratitude on that day. And that is why he offers the peace offering. But it doesn't end there, because he also offers two other korbanot, an olah and a chatat. And those two korbanot are directly associated with the need to repent. Olah, let's start with chatat. Chatat is repenting for a specific sin. You know that you did something on February 25, which you're repenting, and you want to pay for it, you bring a korban chatat. Olah is less specified. Sometimes you know that something is wrong. Sometimes you know that you need to fix something, that you need to do a tikkun, that you need to do a cheshbon nefesh. You need to look into your soul. That's what olah represents. And I think that if the Kohen Gadol only brought the peace offering, only came into the role with the emotions of joy and happiness, that's very dangerous. That's the essence of leadership that is smug, that only looks at the festivity of entering a leadership role. But when you enter a leadership position, the Torah says, no, you have to come with mixed emotions. You can be happy, you can be grateful, but not just that. You also need to be anxious. You also need to worry, because nobody comes clean. You have chatat, you have some past, and nobody is immune from failure. You need to bring the olah. So what I suggest is that when we look at leadership, and when we look at the inauguration of the Knesset in Israel, or the inauguration of the President of the United States here, I would suggest to redo exactly this ceremony. No, I don't mean that we will need to sacrifice calves and cows on that day. No, that's not what I mean. But what I mean is that we need to take the contents, not the words of the ceremony. I suggest that every parliament member goes up to the podium and says only 3 sentences. Sentence number 1, who am I grateful on this day? This is the peace offering. Sentence number 2, what past failures do I want to mention in this occasion? That's the chatat. Sentence number 3, what future temptations, failures, pitfalls am I worried about now that I'm entering my new leadership role? That's the olah. I think that all our leaders should learn this parasha well and maybe take home some of its internal messages. Thank you.
Insightful shir. We're very happy. This was great. And in my closing remarks, I'll say other things. But in the meantime, please feel free to ask any questions. You can either raise your hand and ask it directly, or in the chat bar, you will find as well. So please feel free. Let's wait 1 minute or so, just because it takes time to type, or as I said, you might want to put your thought together. So wait 1 minute or so. So wait, let's see. Any questions for Dr. Barzel? In the meantime, though, we have a question. Here we go. Okay, the question is from Brad. Brad says the following: a teacher of mine encourages students to share the following at the end of
At
every
the
class.
end.
At the end of every class, appreciation, apology, and aha.
Perfect. I take it with two hands. Thanks.
Okay. Let's see. Maybe Baruch, in the meantime, I know that wasn't part of the plan, but as people are, I'm always, now that we have you a little bit, obviously, but maybe you can share a little bit, maybe about your research, 1 minute or so, if it's possible, or maybe something you're working on, or sort of post-COVID, just for a few minutes as we are finishing up.
I'll give you the 1 minute pitch.
Okay, great.
So
go ahead. And then this is give us some time to ask questions. Go ahead, Baruch.
I run the Complex Network Dynamics Lab in Bar-Ilan University. Currently, I'm a visiting professor here in Northeastern, so I live in Boston up until the summer. In the summer, we're going back home. And most people, when I say complex network dynamics, they change the subject. They start talking about the weather. So let me break it down for you very easily. What we want to understand is how complex systems behave. And an example is worth 1,000 words. So I think we'll all agree that our brain is a very complex system. But from a mathematical perspective, what makes our brain a complex system? Well, the answer is that an average human brain has about 100 billion neurons. Maybe here in the Zoom talk, it's a little bit higher than that. I don't know. But an average human brain has about 100 billion neurons. And neurons are very simple units. They can be on or off. So yes, I know they're very complicated internally. But from a brain's perspective, a neuron doesn't have to do much. It has to be active or inactive. But you take 100 billion neurons, you don't get a big neuron. You get a completely different system. There's no neuron that knows how to think or operate or motor skills or get sensory input, but still 100 billion neurons somehow come together and they give rise to all of these completely different phenomena. And there's no simple way to extrapolate by understanding all the nooks and crannies of a neuron, how a brain behaves. So when we have this simple building blocks like neurons that give rise to very complex behavior like a brain, there's a miracle that happens in the middle, and that miracle is exactly what we try to decode in our lab. Now, I'll steal 30 more seconds. This example about simple building blocks and complex behavior, I focused on the brain as an example because it's relatable and people can understand it. But you're probably now scratching your own heads and saying, wait a second, there are many other examples for that. For example, society is constructed from 7 billion individuals, and every individual can be simple, can be sick or healthy, can decide to purchase an iPhone or not purchase an iPhone. But at the societal level, we don't just see a big individual. We see a completely different system. Social behaviors, fads, norms, diseases, which we already mentioned, they are phenomena that occur at the macro scale level, even though each individual is completely oblivious to them, just like each neuron is completely oblivious to its role in the brain. And maybe just one final example, if you take 20,000 genes and put them together, you don't get a big gene, you get a cell. A cell, again, is bigger than the sum of its parts. So all of these instances where we have simple building blocks, somehow miraculously are put together without any central design, without any architect, and give rise to complex behavior. This is what we study in the lab, and we try to understand the mathematics and behind them, and use that to predict their behavior, like will a disease become global or will it be contained, and then affect their behavior. How can we, with the smallest price, mitigate a propagating epidemic, for example? Or how can we reactivate a region of the brain that somehow became malfunctioned by activating some strategic neurons on the way?
Thank you, Baruch. We have a question here from Ari Rosenblum. Ari, you want to unmute yourself? Or you don't want to answer the question?
Maybe I answered it already.
No, I just saw a hand, that's why. Okay.
Thank
He's talking. Here we go. Yes, go ahead.
So, first of all, thank you so much. That was a fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
I just wanted to mention, and I don't know, it's not so much as a question, but in much of what you just said in the last 5 minutes, I heard echoes of, surprisingly, of Asimov and psychohistory. I don't know if this is something you're familiar with, but there's a lot in what you're talking about that is an echo of something that is really 60 years old. So where has the science gone since he started talking about that?
This is a perfect analogy. The difference is that Asimov was science fiction and we try to do science, but the
Right.
analogy is perfect. And that's true. What Asimov had in mind, and I think this is what we have in mind too, is that everything I said about neurons and genes, I could have said about molecules in a glass of water. No one can predict what a single molecule will do, but all glasses of water have very predictable behavior. So a molecule of water is not liquid. It doesn't have phase transitions. It's not transparent. It doesn't have anything that water has. But you put billions of molecules in a cup of water and they have all of that phenomena. So that is exactly what statistical physics does. And we know how glasses of water behave. We've been studying that for 200 years now, and we've completely deciphered that. What Asimov was foreseeing, and what we're actually doing today in science, is we're saying, wait a second, we can use the same mathematical tools, except that instead of molecules, we can think about neurons, genes, bacteria, humans. I'm not saying that a human is a molecule, but from a societal level, sometimes you can treat human behavior using simple physics-like or physics-inspired models. So when people ask me if what I do is physics, my answer is yes. It's the statistical physics of systems that were traditionally not considered physical. But the approach is exactly that. It's to use the same mathematical tools, except we don't look at particles. We look at complex entities. They don't follow Newton's laws. They follow other laws. But that's the point. They follow some laws. And if you know these laws and you know how they interact, you can, okay, it's not as easy as I said, as it seems, but you can attempt to predict their behavior. And I'm not saying, I'm not really trying to social engineer, but to some extent, intervene and affect their behavior. Now, of all human behaviors, a lot of them are very complex. Specifically, the one where we can either be sick or healthy and infect each other is one of the better modeled human behaviors. And on that one, I think COVID has actually shown it. At least the scientists can make pretty good predictions and offer pretty clever interventions. Politicians, not always implement them. That's another thing.
Very good. Okay. So I think we don't have any more questions. So Baruch, we want to take the opportunity to thank you again for giving us this great presentation. And also, as always, we want to, this is very good because people have access to Zoom, but it's always nice to meet somebody in person. So we would love to have you one day by us here in the Riverdale Minyan. And I think that very much what you spoke about very much resonates with our community in general. So, and I'd like to thank each of you, of course, for attending. We have one more Zoom Scholar Residence coming up. That's going to be in May. So there's plenty of time because we have so many other things coming up. Look at your email, of course, for upcoming events and so forth. In the meantime, I wish everybody a freilichen Purim and all the best, and we'll be in touch. Thank you so much again, Baruch, and looking forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you. It was my pleasure, and Chag Sameach to everybody.
Chag Sameach, everyone. Bye-bye.